Okay. Fantastic. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening around the world. This is Doug Brunke, Global Chamber, founder and CEO, and we've had a series of really exciting and interesting conversations this year already, and today is no different because today we're going to be talking to Nate Richards, who's the Sales Director of Alternative Investments at Vistra Group. Nate is zooming in from the other side of the country today, the United States, and we recognize that you're all over the world, so we'll be speaking about opportunities not just in the States, not just in North America, but all over the world. That's where Vistra plays, that's where Global Chamber plays, and we know that's where our Global Tribe plays. Nate has a very fantastic international background. He's got all sorts of experiences, including his time with Vistra. He's from the Boston, Massachusetts area. And Nate, we're really pleased to be speaking with you today about some opportunities for people to grow around the world. You've got a variety of ideas and tips and techniques for people to consider as they expand internationally. And so thank you for your time today.
Great. Thank you, Doug, and thank you to everybody who joined in the Global Chamber of Commerce for putting this together. I look forward to speaking on a few topics that are, that come up on a regular basis in the day-to-day work that we do here at Vistra. And I recognize, having spoken with Doug, and first of all, good morning, good evening. I know that there's a fairly wide range of people joining this presentation today. So, in speaking with Doug, I understand that there is a pretty large variety of folks who are joining the webinar, and you may be at various stages of your life cycle in developing your international strategy, whether that is very early and just going into the first country internationally, or you may be well developed and in multiple countries. So one of the things in kind of putting together our thoughts on what we wanted to maybe touch on was to cover a very wide spectrum, frankly, of topics that really kind of go from that really cover the entire life cycle of how we see companies that are operating overseas, and more specifically some of the kind of topics that come up as key decision points that tend to have more knock-on issues later on that will continue to come up. And we also wanted to try to tie together with some other themes that will consistently come up over and over again, not just in the first time you may be expanding internationally, but for companies that are larger multinational companies that are continuing to look at new countries and explore opportunities. So as far as the agenda today, and I think we can go to the next slide that has agenda, really what I wanted to do was just maybe touch briefly on what Vistra, who we are, and because I think it may put into context some of what we'll be touching on as we continue to go through the presentation. But moving forward, what we really wanted to maybe touch on is the reasons that we see companies expand internationally, and some of the thought processes that we go through with our clients to determine what the appropriate framework is for them to set up overseas. And really what that boils down to is the concept of permanent establishment. And we'll kind of touch on that and some of the options around specifically permanent establishment, and then what type of entity may be appropriate for you given the circumstances that you're looking at. We then have a few considerations that we want to touch on that we've seen in the market, and kind of a way to think through both, again, going back to the full spectrum of potential clients that are first considering setting up internationally, all the way through clients that have very well established and large international operations, and some of the ways to kind of approach thinking about your international structure. And then finally, briefly, going way far to the other end of the spectrum, looking at just a brief kind of scenario around entity rationalization, and something that we're seeing as more of a trend in the market, which is companies that are really taking a second look at their overall international structure and really trying to streamline and understand kind of what they actually need, or more importantly, don't need, in order to continue moving forward. So just moving forward, as I mentioned, Vistra, I've been at Vistra for the better part of 6 years now, working really in 2 different roles. One, on our international expansion side, which is what we're going to be spending most of the time today talking about, but also on our alternative investment side. And at the heart of it, Vistra is a global professional services firm. We support our clients with entity operations across the globe. What that generally means is supporting the setup, the ongoing corporate governance and compliance requirements, and other administrative needs of our clients in local jurisdictions around the world. That's a very broad mandate. So one of the ways to probably better think about it is from a client perspective. And we kind of break that into, I would say, 3 groups, which I have, you can kind of see it here on the presentation. One is what we refer to as alternative investments. These are actual fund managers, so hedge fund, real estate, private equity, venture capital funds that are managing their actual investments and their funds in various markets around the world, and we provide direct administrative support to those managers, as well as down into the deal process. So many times these funds are setting up deals or they're setting up entities in order to house portfolio companies or other investment opportunities, and so we support that. The second group, corporate and private clients, is more high net worth, family office, legal structure support. We have a very large client base that requires those kind of services. And then the third, which is really what we're talking about today and focusing this presentation on, is international expansion. That's working, I would say, primarily with U.S. companies that are expanding internationally, but really any company that is in one home country and looking to do business outside of the country they are currently operating in. And we'll get into what that looks like in a second. We're in just over 45 countries globally, with about 70 office locations. I think we're just north of 4,200 people right now. But just to give you a sense of the scale, we currently service around 200,000 entities globally. So that's kind of, when you think about our business, that's really at the core of it is what we're providing, is those direct support to clients in their local, in the entities in their local areas. So we just go to the next slide real quick. What I mentioned from an investment process standpoint, now, when I kind of describe the Vistra client structure, we kind of cross this entire, kind of investment value process, where we have the investors at the top, fund managers, and actual specific deal processes, and then down to the portfolio companies. And so I kind of sit really where that highlighted box is on the left, which is working with fund managers in supporting their operations and their requirements to, maybe a deal-to-deal requirement, maybe at the fund level, and then more specifically down into the portfolio company level. So one of the things that we work with extensively, we work with venture capital and private equity companies. They look at us as supporting partners for their deals in the particular portfolio companies that they are doing. Now, when it comes to venture capital, we tend to be an efficient way of scaling very quickly internationally. We can also, supplement resources or provide kind of expertise that a smaller company that is just, early stage funded doesn't have. So, many companies that we're working with, there's small HR, small finance teams. They don't really have the internal expertise to be able to manage, the complexities that arise when you're operating internationally, and we can help be a partner and kind of help manage those things. In a private equity perspective, it's a little more deal specific and from a transactional standpoint. So that would be supporting things like M&A or corporate spinoffs, where you need to have multiple entities set up, as part of a deal simultaneously, and we can be kind of the overall support mechanism for that. So really, what we're talking about today is this. And I'm including the fund managers in this scenario, but we're really talking about this portfolio company concept and those portfolio companies expanding internationally. Now, I do recognize that many of the people on this webinar may not be venture backed, you may not be private equity owned, but you most likely are, if you're privately held or if you're public or whatever, you do have accountability to some ownership. The ownership is going to be involved in the decision-making process, especially when it comes to international decisions as to why or when you're going to set up internationally. So I wanted to just kind of capture that, because there is an important element of senior management in terms of the kind of approval and the vision when it comes to looking at your international operations. And that could be within the context of private equity or venture capital ownership, or if it's other ownership as well. So just moving forward, I think what we wanted to maybe start with was just kind of an analysis of why we see companies expand internationally. Now, I actually wrote a blog on this about a year ago, I think, and one of the things that we've done, and this is what we see, most regularly with our clients, is probably 4 scenarios as to why a company would be looking to set up operations internationally. And it's important to kind of think about this and put this into context, because why you are actually expanding is important, because it has knock-on consequences in terms of the decisions you may make, the structure that you set up in, and obviously things like potential tax liabilities in local jurisdictions, employment requirements, and other corporate governance that you may need to set up in order to accomplish what your goals are. So it's important to kind of start from the very beginning. And what we have, and I've outlined them here on this slide, is generally 4 scenarios. So obviously the first scenario, the most straightforward, is when you are looking to enter a new market. Clearly, you have some success in your home country. You have a product that you think you can bring to additional countries, and you're looking to execute on that. One of the most general things that we see is companies that have some success in the US, they want to penetrate the European market, and they're looking to maybe set up, say, in the UK as kind of a beachhead, so that they have a greater presence and the ability to start to find customers, develop the market, and understand how they can potentially grow. So clearly entering a new market. Another scenario that we often see is a new client. This can take a couple different forms. One example is when you've signed a fairly large client, an institutional client. The client may actually be part of a government organization, or just large enough where they want to sign directly with a local entity. We see that often in places like Japan, where doing business with a company that has a local presence is a very important cultural thing. Or the other side of that coin may be that in order to support the client, you do need to have someone on the ground from maybe an implementation standpoint, or maybe it's an ongoing supporting role to directly provide services to that client. So that's another scenario. The third tends to be around key hires. This also tends to have maybe 2 scenarios that we see the most often. One being there's some sort of talent that's very industry specific. Many times in like the biotech world, there's someone with just the right background and the right industry knowledge that you need. The other can be more from an executive level. Oftentimes you're hiring a new CEO or a new CFO. That person happens to be located in a different country. They don't want to move. So you need to figure out a way to accommodate that person in the country that they currently live in, because you don't actually have a presence. And then the fourth, which is fairly straightforward, is obviously having a shared service center. Having this is obviously popular in places like India and Poland, where you can hire a number of people and kind of have a kind of a shared resource for the company. So that generally, those four scenarios tend to cover what I would say would be 90 to 95% of the rationale as to why clients are coming to us to expand their international operations. Now, you have to take those scenarios, and when it really comes down to is determining permanent establishment. That permanent establishment is a term that is in this industry. I'm not sure if some of you may be familiar with it, some of you may not be, but really what permanent establishment at the end of the day is it is a determination that the activities in a particular country that you're involved with rise to the level of having some sort of corporate tax presence. And this is sometimes it's subjective, sometimes it's more objective, but at the end of the day, it's really the country that is going to determine this for you. And if they are determining that, you're already in a tough spot because you're kind of playing from behind a little. But really, what you need to be thinking about are, going back to the scenarios I just outlined, you need to be thinking about kind of what you are doing in that country. Do you have a fixed place of business? Are you potentially wanting to charge clients locally and have revenue go through that country? How many employees are you looking to have in that country? There's a variety of different kind of ways to look at this permanent establishment risk to determine whether you do need to set up, what we refer to as a permanent establishment. Really, again, going back to the idea, when you have a permanent establishment, basically what you're creating is a taxable presence in this country, and that triggers a whole series of downstream requirements, things like local accounting requirements, maintaining local statutory filings, and submitting tax returns. There's a variety of complexities that come in once you have determined that you actually do have a permanent establishment. So that's not to say that you can't accomplish some of the things that we outlined in the scenario 1, 2, 3, and 4 without having a permanent establishment. In certain circumstances, you can have what they call a professional employment relationship. So you can have a third party as a PEO provider. You can potentially have a contractor relationship. And as we'll look at in the next slide, you may have some sort of representative office that isn't necessarily rising to the level of a taxable presence. You do need to be careful of what those activities, and you need to kind of constantly be reassessing what you're doing in the country just to determine whether that presence needs to be reevaluated, and if you really need to be setting something up that is more substantial. Again, going back to the point where you really don't want the government to be coming towards you saying that they believe you have a presence. You really want to already have established that and kind of be sharing with the government what you're doing in that country before they start to raise any questions. As you can see here, so once you've kind of determined you're going to be committing to a country, and you're starting to think about kind of, okay, I'm going to set up something to hire an employee, you do have a couple options. As I mentioned before, so there's what they call representative office. Representative office not every country has this ability, but many countries do allow you to set up what they call representative office. It's a lighter structure. It allows companies to essentially employ somebody in a country, but they don't necessarily have a taxable presence at that point. So you're essentially raising your hand to the local authorities. You're saying that you do have an employee. You're going to comply with all the local HR and employment law requirements. But the activity in the country doesn't necessarily rise to the level of having to file corporate taxes. So there's certain things that you can do under the representative office. You do have to be careful because you potentially can eventually trigger permanent establishment requirements with the representative office. There's limited activities associated with that. When you do come down to the branch and subsidiary options, now you are talking about some sort of local tax presence. Branch and subsidiary are both kind of versions of permanent establishment that allow you to file those corporate returns. Now, I would say the majority of our clients tend to lean towards a subsidiary for a couple reasons. First of all is the subsidiary is a separate legal entity in that particular country, whereas a branch is essentially an extension of your home country office or whichever office you are hanging the branch off of. So in a branch scenario, if there were some sort of litigation locally, it is easily connected to the home office of that branch. So there's a little bit more of connectivity between the entities in that local country and your home country. So that sometimes is not ideal. The other is there are reporting requirements in countries, and when you are doing when you're reporting for tax purposes, statutory accounting purposes, there may be requirements to disclose information about your parent organization. Many private companies do not like to, especially companies that are still early stage, may not want to be disclosing certain financial information publicly because of the branch. So generally, many companies go with a subsidiary, but you do need to evaluate your options and determine what may be appropriate to you. Beyond branch versus subsidiary, the other thing you want to think about is your revenue model in terms of what you're doing in country. You need to have some way to justify to the local government what amount of taxes that you're paying for. And that really comes through with the revenue model, and your justification behind that revenue model could be cost plus, it could be a direct revenue model. But at the end of the day, the principles really need to be around what they call arm's length, which means you really are taking almost a third party view of this and saying, is this fair? Is the work that we're doing in this particular country and the local taxes that we're paying, is it commensurate with the amount of taxes we're paying and the work we're actually doing in that country? So those are the kind of things early stage. Now this could be a company that's first expanding, or a company that's expanded multiple times into other countries, but now is looking at a new country. These are the questions and the kind of the thought patterns that are the first things to think about, because as I mentioned before, they do have knock-on consequences as you move forward and start to set things up. So as you continue to move forward in your growth internationally, clearly, we kind of started with just saying, here's what we want to think about from a setup standpoint, from an entity structure, from an establishment standpoint. One of the things I wanted to maybe just touch on for this presentation was just things to think about in the back of your head as you continue to go down the path of setting up in a particular country. Now, what we've done, and this isn't necessarily a framework, but it is kind of a way to maybe approach things, and we thought we'd give some timely updates and things that we've seen in this. So the first is local considerations. Okay, you really do need to be very careful about understanding all of the requirements that you're getting yourself into when you're expanding into a new country. There are local requirements that are going to really take you by surprise. And for example, I have a couple up here, but in Mexico, many Latin American countries, there's what they call a 13-month pay cycle, which means you have your normal 12-month pay period, and then at some point there's a 13-month bonus period that's required by law. That's not something that you can not do, but you do have to pay that 13-month bonus. Generally happens during the Christmas holidays or sometime around then. And it's just something to think about, because when you are designing your employment contracts, you do want to be mindful that exists. So for example, if you're writing your employment contracts, you want to be careful to say, we will pay you X amount per year in salary. And then when it comes time to actually go through and set up the payroll process, you can take that amount, divide it by 13th, and make those payments. Whereas if your employment contract did state, we're going to pay you, let's say, $4,000 a month, you may not realize it, but you'll be paying $4,000 a month, and then you'll be on the hook for another $4,000 for that 13-month pay cycle. So you may actually end up having to pay one extra month salary that you didn't anticipate if you just structured the employment contract incorrectly. In France, you have to be mindful when you are hiring someone. It will take 12 to 18 months in terms of the termination process. That includes, paying that person's benefits for that period of time, paying an exorbitant amount of severance. It can be a very challenging country to exit from an employee standpoint. So things you want to think about, maybe in that case, you want to think about, can you cover France from a neighboring country? For example, the UK or Germany, where, those people can travel in and, accomplish what you're trying to achieve potentially without having an employee. Those are the kind of things that you also want to think through. The other is evolving requirements. These countries all have their own regulatory framework that is continually updated. And for example, in the UAE, they just introduced a VAT scheme, as well as a requirement to set up employee pensions for all their employees. You just need to be mindful of that. That's in the process. Many of us, we're still trying to figure out exactly what that means and how to do that in a compliant fashion. And so in many cases, the changing environment is evolving. This is very clear in places like Germany and Spain, where some of the accounting requirements are continuing to change in terms of how you maintain accounting records locally, what types of systems are used, and how you report that to the government. So you want to have a very keen understanding of the local considerations. But then we move to what I would refer to as kind of regional considerations. And this is where we kind of get to maybe more of the current affairs version of the presentation, but more subjective that we've seen, and in speaking with my colleagues in Singapore, is a fairly large uptick in company formations right now from clients that are, that had set up in Hong Kong previously. They are looking at the protests and the uncertainty and the risks in Hong Kong, and they are starting to set up entities in Singapore to complement or perhaps shift what they would refer to as their regional headquarters, maybe, or just kind of what they consider their APAC presence in a manner to kind of hedge against maybe further unrest in Hong Kong. Similar to that, and I think everybody's always talking about Brexit and what that means, but certainly there's obviously developments around Brexit. The biggest development, I think, of recent is the fact that it is indeed going to happen. I think that that we've walked through that door, so to speak, and there's probably no looking back from the fact that it will actually exit. But I know that recently there's this timing around the end of January. That we're probably still not going to have a lot of answers before then. I will say that the UK is already committed to spending the EU budgets, or the money that they owe to the EU for the next year or 11 months or so. They're also committed to falling under the rules and requirements of the EU for the next 11 months. So nothing's really changing there right away. And also there's still a lot of questions around the kind of the Irish backstop and things like that need to be worked out. But Brexit's certainly happening, but just as it has been in the last couple of years, there's still a lot of questions around it. The one thing that we've been seeing, I will say, similar to Singapore, but in Germany and the Netherlands, there's certainly an uptick in entity formation, companies that are looking to establish a European onshore presence, where they previously had a UK presence, and that covered their European presence. So there's certainly the uptick in entity formation, but one of the side effects that we've actually seen, and we're starting to get a little more kind of quantitative information about this in terms of salary benchmarking, is a salary uptick. So if you're looking to hire in Germany and Netherlands, it is becoming more expensive to find that talent. All these companies that are forming, they're obviously hiring more, and therefore salaries are going up. So there is a bit of uptick in that we are seeing, and you need to just be aware of that. So those are what we would really, refer to as kind of regional considerations. And then the last is I kind of put into kind of global considerations, and these have to do with kind of thematic elements that are just kind of major topics. Any one of these you could do a webinar on in and of itself, and we actually probably have multiple webinars at Vistra where we've explored these. But things like the economic substance laws and BEPS, where these are multiple countries that are looking to make sure that the right amount of revenue is being taxed in the right countries, really kind of taking away those kind of tax haven concepts and tax jurisdictions where it was advantageous to be set up and having your revenue go through there because it was a smaller tax footprint. So certainly those are considerations. GDPR is a European framework for protecting data. I think one of the many things that we see are companies do not feel that they fall under the GDPR guidelines simply because they don't consider themselves a data company like Facebook or Google. I will say, because you have an employee in the EU, you fall under that guidelines. Because you potentially have sensitive information that can be attached to an individual in the EU, you therefore fall under those guidelines. You have to be aware of what that means for you. The other thing about GDPR is while it's kind of a regional European framework and guideline, the GDPR principles are more and more being taken and used as the kind of foundation for what many other countries are using to put in place for their framework. So we're seeing more in APAC and in even potentially Latin America, where these countries are putting in GDPR type frameworks, and they're really using that as a basis. So GDPR being kind of an EU thing, it's very rapidly gaining global acceptance, and you just want to be aware of that. So having those things in mind, we started with kind of why companies form in the first place, what their decisions are initially, and then obviously thinking through some of the things locally, regionally, globally. The last thing I wanted to maybe touch on is really, again, going back to the far end of the spectrum, is companies that have really expanded rapidly or maybe over time, and start to really see tremendous complexity in their international structures. Now, this happens for a variety of reasons, right? The growth over time may have just dictated setting up in multiple countries. Going back to the scenario where you hired an employee and you were forced to maybe create some sort of presence in a country to accommodate that employee. That employee may be gone now, but you still have the entity remaining. You may have mergers or acquisitions where you've acquired companies, and now you have maybe multiple companies, multiple subsidiaries in a single country. And then also what we often see is there's been a change in ownership. So perhaps there's been a private equity or a venture capital transaction, or maybe the owner founders have sold and there's new private owners. And then also with that often comes executive turnover, right? So leadership within the companies can change. And what that ends up being is what we end up seeing is these very large, complex structures that really need to be kind of reviewed, because there's some significant risks that go along with that. First of all, what we often see is companies don't even know what they have. There's new finance teams, there's new legal teams, and they're still trying to understand kind of what the footprint of their company is internationally. So there's clearly risks from a non-compliance standpoint. There's cost risks to just maintaining all these different entities, and also when you're maintaining all these entities, something can fall through the cracks. So there's a variety of risks around maintaining a very complex and kind of overly burdensome structure. And one of the things that we've been working more and more with clients on, and this can be transactional in terms of, they're looking down the road and saying, we're going to be trying to sell this company at some point. We really like to streamline our structure internationally, remove entities that aren't necessarily required, and reap significant cost savings that come with that. So we go through an entity rationalization process. So the first thing we generally do is map every entity, understand what those entities are doing, the cash flows that kind of go through that, employees associated with that, and then start to create a plan. If you have two entities in a single country, you need to transfer employees over, potentially wind one of them down, look at other entities and determine if it's appropriate to stay in that country or if it's appropriate to move. Oftentimes, you may find an entity in what we call a dormant status, where that was set up a while ago and we haven't really done anything with it. But before you decide to strike it off, there may be something in the next quarter, 2 quarters, year, where you have a strategy to kind of re-enter that country and develop the market. So you may want to keep that entity around, because closing an entity and then having to reopen one can be even more challenging than just kind of keeping something dormant. So you got to go through the process of thinking through what you want to do with your existing footprint, and then how you see that grow with you over time. So just something to think about. This slide really ultimately is kind of the end knock-on effect of all of the decisions that happen at the beginning, what I talked about when you're determining what you want to do and how you want to set up. So, so with that, it's a fairly broad set of topics here. Hopefully it gave you some things to think about when operating internationally. And I think that is about the extent of what the slides I had, Doug. So happy to, I guess, take some questions or speak further.
Okay. Thank you, Nate. In terms of kind of how it works then between a client and Vistra, so are you typically going through this conversation with them in terms of how they should be setting up, or maybe on the flip side of it where they might already have some sort of a setup and they're just doing some sort of a review of, are we set up correctly in these 10 countries or whatever? Walk us through how it normally would work.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it kind of goes right to the core of the presentation. So I think, when we first start talking with a client, it's really important to us to understand, and I go right back to those scenarios as to why they are looking to expand internationally. Having a real thorough understanding of what is the rationale behind, the interest in a particular country, and not necessarily the immediate rationale. It may be an employee or a market or a client, but what's the longer term vision? Because, understanding kind of what you hope to get out of the business and how it grows in a particular country will potentially, kind of dictate what types of choices you want when it comes to the type of entity you want to form and how soon you want to form it. So keep in mind, many countries, it takes, it can take, between 3 to 6 months. In more complex countries like China, you're talking about potentially a year to set up an entity. So if you're kind of thinking about putting a toe in the water and say, oh, we just want 1 employee, but within a year we're going to have 10, well, you might just want to start right away and start setting that entity up. Whereas if you really are thinking, hey, we're only going to have 1 employee and it's going to be like that for the next several years as we look to, kind of understand if this is a market we want to be in, well, then that's a different set of potential requirements and a different structure that you may indeed decide to set up on. So it's very important to really outline the drivers behind what you're trying to accomplish in the country, and then align that with the appropriate structure that you would then execute and ultimately have these employees or this business in that country for.
Another question here, and those of you who are out there, send your questions to info@globalchamber.org. or you can ask your question in the box there. We have one in the box, and we've answered that separately. And we've got some on info@globalchamber.org as well. So please send them in, whatever is easier for you. In terms of specific countries where it may be either more, the question is around how easier countries to set up. Are there certain kind of safer places that you often point people to say, if you're in Asia, set up here and kind of base things out of? And conversely, not ask, but as long as we're asking that, are there others that are more difficult that you steer people away from?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say in our role at Vistra, we don't really try to steer companies towards or away from a particular country. As I had mentioned before, it kind of goes back to, you as a company are really going to have your rationale as to what you need to accomplish in that country. And it may or may not be feasible to be set up in that country. Now, I used in the presentation, I used the example of France. We oftentimes, when someone comes up to us, especially if someone comes up to us and hasn't really had previous international experience, or even kind of French international experience, we will actually really be very careful to ask, is this really something that you want to do with this? Maybe let's just use the example of an employee. They have someone they want to hire, because of the complexity in the HR law, France can be very challenging. So is that something that, again, as I used in my presentation, can you accomplish what you're trying to do, maybe by having someone in the UK or Germany that can travel to France from time to time and kind of maybe accomplish it? Or do you really need to have the boots on the ground and that person there? So France may be an example of that, where you're just that would be more from an HR law related. There are other countries that have more complex requirements than others. Now, one of the things that we do at Vistra is we kind of define countries as open or closed countries. And this is a requirement you have to think through when it comes to the kind of the operational setup in these countries. So open countries refer to countries that once you set up an entity, you as a company can actually maintain the accounting and finance requirements outside that country. So, for example, you can manage the accounting books for that country, on your home server in the U.S. or on some sort of spreadsheet or whatever. It can be outside the country, and what ends up happening on an annual basis is you take the accounting records, you put them into a locally compliant format, and you submit them to the country for tax return purposes. In closed countries, so this is places like Brazil, China, there's a variety of other countries. Germany is starting to go towards this direction. Closed countries refer to countries where the accounting associated with that entity is required to be maintained in country, usually on some sort of locally approved system, and it needs to be there. It needs to be, there could be someone from the authority that literally will walk in the office and demand to see the books, and they need to be set up on that system in that office. So that adds a layer of complexity when you talk about the operational requirements. So certainly we're careful to make sure that we're advising our clients on kind of those requirements. From just an overall standpoint, there are clearly countries that are easier. There are clearly countries that are more complex. So places like the UK, even with Brexit, you can still set up an entity fairly quickly, and the requirements from a kind of a reporting, tax reporting, compliance standpoint are fairly straightforward and easy to understand. It also happens to be an English-speaking country. Whereas other places, I'm thinking of maybe like Malaysia, where the setup requirements are very complex. It can be, there's even things in Malaysia, for example. I was actually just working with a client. Part of the requirements to set up in that country was it was a requirement for them to plant 100 trees. I think that was it. And they were able to accomplish that through some sort of essentially some sort of allocation to a company that kind of does it for them. But it's certainly a compliance requirement that kind of comes out of left field. That goes to really understanding local country requirements. And then it's up to the individual company to determine if they still want to go forward with setting that up, or can they accomplish what they need through another means.
Oh, so is an entity that sets up and plants trees a branch office?
That's a good point.
Okay, sorry about that. A question from Ken. Do you work with companies that want to set up in the U.S. and do you offer tax advice?
Yes, we do. So many times we have a U.S. tax presence. We have offices here in Boston and New York, and also on the West Coast that provide services for U.S. tax support. Now, I would say the majority of the time, the U.S. tax support that we're providing has to do with companies that are internationally headquartered and looking to come into the United States. From kind of a traditional international expansion standpoint of U.S. companies that are going outbound, many times they already have their U.S. tax team in place. They have tax advisors already, kind of ingrained. And so we are focused more on the international component of their business from a U.S. standpoint. If they do need some support, we're able to step in and help. But the U.S. tax component of our business tends to be what we refer to as inbound. So that's international companies coming into the U.S. But certainly we are able to help with U.S. tax.
Okay. Ken is based in San Diego, so it sounds like that would be convenient. And
yeah, yep.
And yesterday, actually, I met with a group from Malaysia, several different companies, and they were asking questions all in this area. So would a normal process be to connect them either with you or somebody on the West Coast?
Yeah, I mean, so generally, the first thing that would happen from a standpoint of the Vistra process is you would speak to someone like me. Now, I'm the guy who's just dangerous enough to do a webinar like this, and but we certainly have very very qualified professionals that have deep expertise in things like U.S. tax. Now, the process would be you would speak to someone like myself, and we would put this into a broader context and really kind of go through some of the questions that we've already talked about on this webinar to try to understand the fact pattern, at which point we would bring in one of our tax experts to really dive into the specific options you may have and what that process would look like if you were to take a certain direction.
Okay, got it. There's also a question from Emmy, I believe in Miami, and Emmy's asked if we can get a copy of the slides. Do you mind if we distribute your information?
Yeah, certainly. Happy to send that deck out.
Okay, very good. So anybody else interested in that, please let us know. In terms of U.S. companies then going outbound, how does that process work? Is it very similar where they'd be talking to somebody based in the U.S. and then you have a team around the world, I believe? Yeah, so from a U.S. standpoint, we have a presence in just about every major market in the U.S. And just to give you kind of a sense of our operational support framework, when you engage with us, we actually have kind of you're going to work with someone such as myself to kind of determine what this framework will look like and what the scope of the project will be. But when we actually get into the point where we're now engaged in helping you set up, what happens is there's multiple teams that get involved. And we have a software platform called Overseas Connect, which kind of connects all the dots from an HR standpoint, from a compliance standpoint, from an accounting, and from a legal standpoint. That's kind of the platform that provides visibility into your operations. Behind that is the actual teams that are doing the day-to-day work. So
the actual setup of the company, the ongoing things like payroll for the employees, as well as the accounting and compliance requirements associated with those entities. We also have an advisory team. The advisory team is there to work through a lot of the questions that we just talked. So we mentioned the U.S. tax team. We also have an HR, a legal, and a global mobility team. Global mobility being very important because a lot of these decisions sometimes come in the context of, hey, we'd like to send someone over to a different country for 3 months, for 6 months, for 2 years. What does that mean? What does that look like? How do you accomplish that? So the advisory team gets involved in kind of the options and creating that. But then we also have what we call as a client service director, and they are really the single point of contact for everything that we may be providing. So you may be in multiple countries. You may have different setups in each country depending on the scenario that you expand into that country for. So you'll have kind of the client service, your client service director, who is really in charge of kind of understanding the overall framework and being kind of your business partner. And then we have the operational teams that are doing the day-to-day work, supporting you in those individual countries, both with the setup and the ongoing operational support.
Next question is, what's the most common issue or problem that you need to address when someone comes and sits down with you? What are some things that people have already progressed on and now there's an issue with it that needs to be undone or unwound?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think what I would say from my perspective, I think one of the most common challenges that I have when I sit down with a client is the connecting between the verticals within the organization. So what I mean by that is let's just take a scenario of like a market expansion situation. The mandate may come from like the senior sales director, and he or she may want to hire someone in a new market just to get the wheels turning and start to generate some customer revenue in a new market. Now, to that person, all they're thinking about is, hey, we just want to hire this person, and then all of a sudden the HR team gets involved because it's a new hire. The HR team is trying to hire the individual. They're looking at employment contracts, but what the HR team doesn't realize is they're making decisions that have knock-on consequences for finance, accounting, tax, and legal that they need to be aware of, and so it's connecting all of those different dots and making sure that everybody's on the same page. Because one of the biggest problems we have is there's an expectation from the HR standpoint, but finance and legal have very different views of what they're trying to accomplish, and so those don't always align in the right way. So the HR team, like, they're really just trying to get this employee hired. The finance team is looking and saying, well, we don't really want to have a legal presence in this country. We don't want to have a tax obligation in this country. Is there another way to do it? And so it's bringing all those voices in and finding the right path forward is probably one of the biggest challenges that we have.
Okay, and how does that get resolved? Is getting everybody?
Well, I would say it's generally it ends up on someone's desk, right? That choice ends up. I would say more often than not, it ends up on the CFO's desk, and they are the ones that will kind of look at the various options and dictate the path forward. Now, having then to kind of go back and accommodate for that. That's, for example, if the CFO looks at a country, let's just say you want to hire someone in Singapore, but the CFO doesn't want to commit to having a legal entity in Singapore. Well, now you have to go back and say, well, what are maybe some other options of hiring someone but not establishing that legal entity? What are the risks involved? Are you comfortable with those risks if they exist? And kind of find a way to still accommodate that if you can, without maybe setting up the entity, right? So at the end of the day, there's generally one decision maker that's kind of dictating specifically around that permanent establishment issue that we talked about at the outset. And then kind of once that decision's made, everybody kind of has to fall in line and figure it out from there.
Okay. At that point, do you sometimes refer them to a partner who might, for instance, be able to take on the responsibility of that employee versus having it within house?
Yeah, so we have multiple partners. We have partners that will take on employees in a professional employment organization (PEO) capacity. I will say, from a PEO standpoint, in the United States, it's a much more widely accepted framework of employment. So you have these very large organizations out there like TriNet and Insperity that kind of run these models, and it's much more accepted. In other countries, it's not quite as established from a legal perspective. And the only other point that we often try to make from a PEO standpoint, or even a contractor standpoint, is you can always hire a contractor, and have that relationship. But there's risks to both. There's risks to both, and there's rationale as to why you would or would not want to do both. But the one thing, both with a contractor and a PEO situation, is you have to be mindful of the fact that when a government looks at you as a company, they are going to look at the activities that are taking place in their country, and they're going to be determining permanent establishment based on the activities that are taking place. And so they're going to look at that employee, and even if that employee is employed by a third party, potentially the activities that employee is carrying out, and other considerations would still lead to you having a permanent establishment. So you need to be careful and understand things like office space. Even if you, for example, you may have a client that is providing hosted office space for you. If there is a desk that's dedicated to you, that could be considered a fixed place of business, and therefore a PE risk. So there's things that you can get into very quickly that kind of bring that risk level up. So while there are other options, and we are happy to bring in the right partners to see if that works out, we're just always mindful to make sure that you have to be educated and you have to understand kind of what the risks are, what the activities, what the level of those activities are before you kind of fully jump in on those.
Well, we've come to the end of the hour. You mentioned about becoming educated. We've become educated today. So thank you very much. Really great information. We have some people for you to speak with for sure because of what you're able to do. And so thank you for the information, the content, and those of you interested in contacting Nate, you can go to the Global Chamber directory. You can send an email to info@globalchamber.org, whatever's easier. Let us know how we can connect you. Over the next 2 days, we have several different Globinars. Tomorrow we have two, one on the opportunities in central Mexico. That's going to be hosted by Global Chamber Guanajuato. And then later in the day, and then also continuing on for the rest of the world on the 16th, we have a marketing lead generation for service providers by Tom Poland. Two different sessions. One's at 4 in the afternoon Eastern time. Another one is 2 a.m. Eastern time on the 16th to cover the rest of the world. So take a look at our website, globalchamber.org, and see those. And then on the 16th also, we have a conversation with several people about site selection. What are some of the things that you should be thinking about above and beyond what we talked about today, which was largely around how you're going to be structured. What about commercial real estate? What are some of the other decisions that you need to make in terms of picking an office, picking a site, picking a location? And we'll be talking about that on Thursday. Nate, again, thank you very much. And thank you for everybody around the world for tuning in. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.